My name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph. And in this talk, I'm going to consider the theme of a theology of vocation, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. And I think to begin with, to clear the ground perhaps, it just goes almost without saying that theology of vocation in general, and there's no kind of like goal in the sense of everyone who hears this theology of vocation should, become a religious. The point of it isn't to convince everyone to embark upon a religious vocation. It's just to spell out vocation in light of God's providence. Well, first in light of God's nature, His plan for our lives and how we fit in that. And then a couple of simple principles for discernment. Nothing huge, groundbreaking, or otherwise mind-blowing, but just simple, straightforward, easy to digest. And then we'll just do a little bit of application at the end about how those principles perhaps are best used when discerning a religious vocation in particular. So, no pressure, really simple, hopefully helpful. So, anytime you consider a vocation, whether you're discerning it or teaching it, or otherwise simply trying to understand it better, you begin with God. So with any supernatural consideration, a destiny or a vocation, you begin with the triune life. And we would see vocation as being an element of God's creation, as proceeding forth from God in love. So we can begin with the question then, why did God create us? Why did God create us? Sometimes I'll ask this in high school classrooms, and I'm hoping for a certain answer, and sometimes I'll get other answers. So one gal once raised her hand and said, because he was lonely. In nice terms, I said, that's wrong. That was actually the very answer I was hoping to steer us away from, but thank you for saying it, I suppose. So no, God did not create us because he was lonely. So you can think about it. God enjoyed perfect, limitless, infinite, boundless life and beatitude. He needed for nothing. He didn't create out of some felt lack, as if God had some human-shaped hole in his heart, and he was pining away in his heavens until he encountered a sufficient object of his love. No, that's not it. Decidedly not. God needed for nothing. Needed for nothing. In truth of fact, all of creation proceeds from God's boundless life and love. I have a friend who says, why did God create? Because he thought we might like it. Alternately, God created us, you could say, because he had a secret too good to keep. The secret of his divine life. And he wanted to afford creation an opportunity to partake of that divine life, to share it, to enjoy it. And so, you could say, in a certain sense, creation is for us. Creation is for us. Now, it's for us in the sense that we find our beatitude in being for God, but it's not because God needs it. It's out of sheer gratuity, sheer love. All right? So, we have the opportunity in creation to return to God in love, to share in his utterly perfect and unchangeable goodness. All right? Now, the next thing in considering creation that we perceive is that there is a variety. There are lots of different created things. So you have, rocks. You have plants. You have animals, some of which lived a long time ago and will never live again, like dinosaurs. Okay, part of God's creative plan. You have human beings, all right? So you have all of these different created things, and each of them is unique in a certain respect. Each of them possesses perfections peculiar to that type of thing. Now, why would God be so prodigal? Why would he be so generous or lavish? Think of it this way. God is utterly simple. That's simple in the sense not of simple-minded, like God can only think of one thing because he's not sharp enough, he's not smart enough to conceive of others. That is to say that all of God's attributes, his goodness, his knowledge, his will, all of it is God. All of it is the divine essence. We have this in the scriptures in 1 John. God is love. Not God has love or God partakes of love, but God simply is love. All right? So all of the divine attributes come together in utter simplicity. There's no composition. There's no division in God. But here's the thing. God's richness, his unsurpassable life, all of this bounty, this simplicity, cannot be spoken in a single created word. There is no one word that captures all of that infinite life. And so, he speaks it in many words. You can think of God's goodness, his simple goodness, the white light of divine being passed through the prism of creation and being, in a certain sense, separated into a visible spectrum. In his Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas Aquinas writes, with us, composite things, that is, things which are cobbled together from different elements, are better than simple things, because the perfection of created goodness cannot be found in one simple thing. But the perfection of divine goodness is found in one simple thing. All right? So that one simple thing, the divine life, the divine essence, in order to be made manifest more adequately, more perfectly, more fully, speaks in a variety of tongues, through a variety of creatures, in a number of varied ways. So you can think about how we get a different sense of the glory of God from different facets of creation. So we learn something about God, from like a mother's love and her tenderness and her care and the compassion that she shows to her children. And we learn something else, something distinct from God, or about God, from, say, like the sublimity, the grandeur of the Grand Canyon. All right? Both of those in God are one thing, but we have a distinct or a varied experience of that grandeur in the different elements of creation. All right? So, now, here's the next piece. Creation doesn't just tell us about God statically, as if each element of creation were fixed and could only say just that one word unto eternity. No, we perceive that every element of creation is somehow straining, somehow moving, somehow impelled towards its goal. It's all in motion back to God. It's all returning to God. And so, we can perceive the glory of God in the trajectory of creation, in how creation is in movement, all right? So, what we're going to see with our lives is that we have a movement towards the glory of God. And that will be helpful in discerning that to discover what it is that we're made for, what it is that we're called to. All right, now we're going to turn particularly to vocation, how our lives, our one beautiful life, fits in this whole big manifestation of God's grandeur. And we can begin with a kind of introductory consideration. Is it enough to just consider our nature left to itself? So just human nature without a consideration of grace and anything supernatural? The answer, no surprise here, is no, okay? Because there are, first, complications introduced by sin. So with original sin, we lose that original grace in which man was created, and we lack the means to go back to God. We lack the means to live a divine life and to live out our adopted sonship, adopted daughtership. And it's just the case that to attain to make our way to a supernatural goal, you need supernatural means. You need the instruments that are sufficient for that goal, okay? So if you want to be an excellent football player, you need to invest in good equipment, or else you're going to get injured and you'll never make it to the goal. If you want to be a saint, you need to have grace. You need to have sufficient means to attain to the end, okay? And that's true of all vocations. So think about it. Marriage is a sacrament, which means it gives grace, which means in order to get to that grace-giving font of life, you need grace moving you there. You need a supernatural appetite for a supernatural banquet, okay? So too of religious life. Religious consecration is a sacramental, another element of a grace life. So too of priesthood, orders, sacraments, all right? So to get to grace, you need grace. God alone creates it. We beg for it. But more on that later. Now, can we leave nature wholly aside and just give it no consideration? For instance, let's say you want to be an astronaut, okay? That's a natural desire. But should you give that any consideration? Is there any indication of what you might be made for in that? Perhaps, perhaps. We shouldn't just scrap nature because it's not supernature. There's this old Thomistic dictum, a kind of saying that's often repeated in the schools, that that grace doesn't destroy nature, but it builds, it perfects it, it elevates it, it heals it, all right? So nature has something to say about how we go back to God, all right? Obviously not everything, and not the most important thing, but something to say. And I think you can consider it in this way. God creates us with the intent of saving us. So how he makes us is somehow a blueprint, somehow an indication of how he plans to save us, all right? So if he makes you, for instance, like a melancholic Irish American, all right? Say you just, speaking from experience, say you have emotions and like you just keep them here and you plan on dying without ever sharing them. Or say that you're just interior and brooding and always staring out windows and mulling about how the world's terrible, okay? He's going to save you somehow through that. He's probably not going to turn you into like this super happy, clappy, joyful person. You're going to be saved in accord with how you're made, all right? You may never be like, yay, Jesus, but he can use your nature to somehow bring about his glory, all right? So, nature is somehow indicative for how he's going to save you. And grace will strengthen that nature, it will heal that nature, it will purify that nature, but it's not going to scrap it, okay? It's not going to scrap it. And there's one particular facet of nature that is worthy of our consideration when it comes to discernment. That is desire, okay? So, desire. Why consider desire? What is it that desire indicates to us about our supernatural vocation? Well, here's the thing. We talked about how everything in creation somehow shows, somehow tells forth the glory of God. And it doesn't do it just like statically. It does it in motion. It does it with a kind of motive force, all right? There's a dynamism to it. Well, desire is just that dynamic element of the human heart, okay? So everything created moves towards its destiny, all right? You can think about like natural inclination or natural appetite. An example that St. Thomas Aquinas gives, which I suppose is a little bit humorous from the standpoint of modern physics, is like a rock loves the center of the earth, okay? So it's always going to incline towards the center of the earth unless it's stopped by something, which prevents it from continuing to fall. So too with like animals, all right? We talk about instinct, all right? Or sensitive appetite. They see things and they recognize them as somehow perfecting their nature. So like a baby wolf, all right? Doesn't really need to learn that sheep are delicious. It just sees sheep and it says yum, okay? So there's this thing in the wolf that moves it towards what perfects its nature. It knows if I destroy that thing and consume it, I'm gonna be more wolfy, all right? And that's good, so let's go, all right? So that's how sensitive appetite works. You see something and then you like want to assimilate it. Now, in our lives, we have a spiritual faculty that inclines us to what we're made for, all right? We call it rational appetite or the will, all right? Just think simply in biblical language of the heart, all right? What is it that we are inclined to that perfects our human life, all right? Our human nature. And so, as a kind of provisional answer to the question of vocation, we find it here at this level of desire, at this level of love. And the simplest response to the question, what am I called to, is what are you passionate about? What animates you? What gives life to you? What is it that sets you about, or sets you dancing, or sets you in motion? Okay? St. Augustine of Hippo has this beautiful line. It's pondus meum amor meus, which is to say, my weight is my love. Okay? My weight is my love. So weight is what gets drawn by gravity. So too, our love is what gets drawn by the gravity of good things to which we are inclined, that perfect our natures and make us happy. Okay? So, now, before advancing, a couple of caveats, a couple of warnings, potential pitfalls. Desire cannot be simply followed like naively or without criticism, all right? Because we always have to contend with, and we always have to be critical of, the effects of original sin, all right? So the one with which we're most familiar is concupiscence, right? And concupiscence is that element of original sin that affects our emotions or passions and makes it so that we're always kind of slouching to what's easier, to what's more immediately satisfying, to what tastes better, or to what's shiny, you know? So just whatever grabs our attention and distracts us from higher things, okay? So, spiritual goods, vocation included, our supernatural destiny, will ultimately be more satisfying, all right? And pursuing that's going to purify our desire. But it takes work, okay? It takes work, because you have to learn to savor and to enjoy the taste of spiritual goods. Because at the outset, they are difficult. At the outset, they're a bit forbidden, you know? Anyone who's like tried to pray knows that it's exhausting, all right? You spend your first 5 years of religious life just trying to stay awake and fend off distraction, okay? It's like the life of prayer, all right? It's hard, all right? So, that's our first caveat, is that original sin, you know, we have these effects of original sin, and we're always going to be drawn to lower goods. So it's going to involve the struggle, it's going to involve purification and criticism of those lower desires, so that we can learn to savor spiritual goods. And our desires are part of that, all right? Our desires have to be purified from lower, least, and lazy to what's exalted and beautiful and noble and ultimately worthy of the whole of our lives, all right? Now, the other thing, too, is because supernatural vocation is a grace, we're not ever, in a strict sense, due the revelation of that thing, all right? We can't, like, merit it in the strictest of strict senses, all right? Before the kind of altar of vocation, we come as beggars, we come as suppliants, all right? It's something that we have to learn always to crave more, okay? God gives it, and he delights to, give to those who ask, knock, seek, all right? But we're beggars before the throne of grace. And so there's no like 5-step program to having absolute moral certainty over what you're called to, all right? There's no timeline that we can chart. It's a grace. It visits us on God's timing, okay? And sometimes his timing requires patience, because in the crucible of patience, we learn to love that vocation more, and we strain towards it with greater desire. So sometimes that's just part of his plan, okay? We come as beggars. That's tough. That is difficult news, but it's true, and it's purifying, and it's good, all right? So those are just 2 warnings, all right? So then, we considered, is nature enough? We said no. We need supernature. We need grace. And then we talked about how desire is this really privileged place of learning the Lord's will for you, because it's what actually inclines you to what perfects you, all right? And we pointed out 2 warnings, 2 caveats. And so now we're at the stage where we can just pose a kind of ultimate question, the question of vocation in the kind of starkest of terms, all right? So given what's gone before, we can formulate it in this way. In what way, in what sense, how am I uniquely suited to tell forth the glory of God? And how do I discern that destiny working at the level of desire? All right, what is it that I love most? So going back to our theology of creation, God speaks his simplicity in a variety of ways, and there's a way for me. There are certain things of God that I am uniquely suited to make known in the world. All right? And he is communicating to that fact to me at the level of desire. And discernment is acquiring the taste for just that reality, all right? And it's going to be gradually made known through what I love, all right? Now, how is it that we perfect desire? How is it that we train our loves, purify them, elevate them, heal them? Well, this is the life of virtue, okay? Virtues are what kind of get in there into your heart and all the nooks and crannies of your reasonable life and elevate every aspect of human life, all right? All of it is going back to God, and the only thing he's going to scrap, the only thing he's going to destroy is sin, all right? So the virtues are going to train up all of these desires, all right? So, to speak even more precisely, our identity, our vocation, our Christian mission, the way that we're destined to tell forth the glory of God is based in a certain sense on just how the life of virtue develops in my soul, okay? Now here's the thing. How is it that I can somehow uniquely live a life of virtue, okay? Because there's this pagan teaching, which the Christian authors take up, namely that all of the virtues are connected, all right? So if you get one virtue, you get all of them. So if that's the case, then all Christians have exactly the same kind of virtuous life within them. So wouldn't it stand to reason that they'd all be called to the same thing? Well, no. Okay, let's illustrate that. How do we account for this variety of vocations? How do we account for the variety of ways in which Christians show forth the glory of God? Here we can draw a kind of analogy to temperament, okay? So I referenced earlier our melancholic Irish American, and we have a variety of ways in which a reasonable life can be lived out. So those the four humors, this kind of pagan notion of different temperaments, which gets picked up, in psychology in the 19th and 20th century. This just provides a good analogy for how people are different. All right, so we all have minds, we all have hearts, and we're all inclined to the good. We're all men and women, human beings, but we live out that rational life in different ways. Which is to say, we have different personalities. Okay. And so some people are more, melancholic, kind of sad sack. Other people are more bubbly, happy, can roll with the punches. You got your sanguine types, your phlegmatic types. The born leaders, who dominate conversation and just want to, storm the beachhead, choleric folks. All right? So the way in which they live out their rational lives is in accord with how they're made. And so too the virtues are going to perfect those tendencies in different ways, okay? And you can think here of how, in the tradition of the church, certain saints are more associated with certain virtues, okay? So, all of the saints have all of the virtues, but we think St. Philip Neri, the apostle of joy, all right? Who had this overabounding love and a sense of tomfoolery, who was always just having a great time, all right? Then you can take St. John Paul II, for instance, a man whom we associate with Christian hope, who hoped for 2 generations of Christians and whose hope conquered an untold number of evils, especially in Europe, Or you can think of St. Maximilian Kolbe. Here is a man of incredible courage, all right? So when the prisoner lamented, my wife, my children, he didn't hesitate, just went and said, I am a priest, I'll take this man's place. That's incredibly courageous, and went singing to his grave. They couldn't starve him. Here's a man of such vigor, all right? So, in the lives of the saints, we see a kind of peculiar or pronounced manifestation of certain virtues. So too in the lives of all Christians, all right? Our vocations actually emerge from how the virtuous life is tailor-made to our pursuit of God, all right? How those virtues coalesce in a unique way, in the way proper to Father Gregory, So that's just the story, the kind of personal, organic, historical, free story of my life, of my sanctification, my supernatural destiny. Now, before moving on, we're going to conclude with a consideration of how this works in the religious state. I just want to dismiss a couple of false notions of vocational discernment, which a lot of us entertain in the back of our thoughts and can really make it difficult to move forward, all right? So one false theory I will call the Gnostic theory, all right? Gnostic just comes from the Greek word for knowledge, gnosis, okay? And what the Gnostic theory generally holds is that Jesus has a kind of basket or bushel of knowledge, kind of care packages, and in that care package is your vocation, okay? And he can give you that little care package whenever he chooses, all right? So there probably is some foreordained time in your life when Jesus is going to tell you exactly what he wants from you, but you don't know when it is, which is terrifying. And you'll often hear people say, I want to do whatever the Lord asks of me, I just don't know what it is. Here's the thing. That's okay, because you're growing presently in the life of virtue, which prepares you to embrace your vocation at whatever time that becomes known, at whatever time that becomes felt, convicted at the level of desire, okay? So the problem with the Jesus with a bushel of care packages is that it makes it seem a little bit, it makes him seem kind of capricious, like he just does things at his whimsy, like he's like, I could let him know, but I prefer that he suffer for it a little bit, which is just, it's a little bit scary, okay? That makes Jesus out to be a little bit strange, all right? And the problem with that too is that it really robs the present of its meaning, okay? So think about the theory that we've proposed, that vocation arises out of virtue. Well, that makes every moment precious, because at every moment you're growing this life of grace, this organic life of grace, this water welling up within you unto eternal life. And you're growing the desires which make it possible to say yes and to grow unto perfection. But if it's just a knowledge packet, what's the point? All right? Say that knowledge packet says that Margaret is going to marry Daniel in 3 years and 6 months. But Daniel, let's say he works for an engineering firm, and he's doing a rotation in Hong Kong for the next 3 years, all right? Margaret lives in Arlington, Virginia, all right? Why do the next 3 years matter at all for her? Why not just cryogenically freeze herself and wait till she comes home? What's the point? What's the point of growing in virtue unless it makes you better disposed, more apt and generous to make of yourself an offering to your spouse, And that means that this present moment matters. You're actually growing unto your vocation, and it means something. But if it's just a knowledge packet, and it's something that you recognize and then just move on, that just strikes me as patently false. So that's our first thing that we want to rule out. Second thing, I'm going to call this the sensationalistic theory, all right? So sometimes, perhaps at a youth conference, you often hear very sensational vocation stories, okay? So for instance, it was the 70s. I was working for the cartels in Medellin, and I was piloting a single-man sub in the Gulf of Mexico when the Coast Guard came up on my tail, sunk the sub, dropped me to the bottom of the Gulf, dredged me up, brought me to the beach, resuscitated me, and then I heard God's voice say, "You're called to be a priest." And I knew it in my bones. I entered the seminary, and I've been happy ever since. And if you're like me, you're sitting in the audience and you think, okay, I was born, I was baptized, I lived a pretty boring life, and then I became a Dominican, and apparently God doesn't love me, It's like, holy Hannah, unbelievable, look at this guy, what a fantastic story. Clearly, my boring life means nothing by comparison. Well, let's slow down. Let's unpack that for a second. Okay. I suggest to you that the sensational stories, the Saul on the road to Damascus, the priest, working for the cartels in the 70s, I suggest to you that those are departures more. They are the exceptions more than they are the rule, okay? I think that more often than not, a vocation develops kind of secretly, in hidden ways, slowly, over the course of time, such that one gradually acquires the savor for that supernatural vocation, okay? And it becomes something that, in time, is easy to choose. It's joyful, it's prompt to choose, okay? All right? It doesn't necessarily require of God this huge and radical conversion. I think, though, here's a theory to explain how the two coordinate, all right? One of C.S. Lewis's favorite fantasy authors, a gentleman named George MacDonald, had a theory about miracles, and he grouped Christ's miracles in the gospel into certain categories. And one of those categories was what he described as things that happen instantaneously which otherwise happen over the course of time, okay? And one of the examples that he gives is the miracle at the wedding feast of Cana. So think about this. God takes water, makes wine, changes water into wine instantaneously. How do we ordinarily make wine? Well, you have a vintner who plants a vineyard. Rain, makes it such that the plants grow. You cultivate those plants, you take the grapes, you crush them, they ferment, you have wine. So you have water, and it becomes wine. So God does instantaneously what in the course of nature usually takes time. I think that these sensational stories of conversion just show instantaneously what ordinarily takes time. Okay, so the life of grace